Hey AP Psych students, it's Megan here with Fiveable. Tonight we are going to be learning all about cognition, but before we jump in, there's a few things I just want to make sure everyone knows about. There's some exciting changes happening here at Fiveable, and so we just wanted you to know that if you're here tonight, these live sessions are free. Which is exciting, right? You guys can tune in, you can tell your friends, you can always join these live sessions and get support and watch for free. And then we'll be offering some subscription options that allow you to go back and watch, sessions from September, October as we get closer to the AP test. And we'll even be hosting some new things. This is a new thing that Fiveable is doing called cram sessions as we get closer to the AP date. And so if you're a subscriber, you'll have access to that, which is basically you can ask any questions you want about any topic in AP Psychology, and we'll do our best to get you those answers. So make sure you tell your friends to come join these live sessions because they should be pretty useful for everyone. I did throw a question up in the chat. If you guys have any questions tonight, or if you can think of any questions that might be beneficial, please throw them in the chat or in the Ask a Question tab. We can make this a little more interactive if you guys like. So we are finishing our talk today about cognition, which then next week will lead us into testing and individual differences. We're just doing one day on that entire unit because it's a pretty short unit and it only makes up about 2% of the AP test. And then we're rolling into another heavy hitter unit, which is motivation and emotion. And we're going to spend 3 weeks talking about all of the different theories of motivation and emotion and things that go along with that. So that'll be a 3-week unit. Starting us off in February. As always, we're here Tuesday nights from 8 Eastern time for about half hour, 45 minutes, depending what we had to cover each night. So to recap the cognition unit so far, we've talked about memory formation, memory storage, memory retrieval, how we think about and analyze information, and then finally tonight we're talking about language and language development. Again, this is an 8 to 10% unit of the AP exam, so it's a heavy hitter, which is why we broke it down into 3 separate nights so that we can hopefully focus on all the different aspects of it, make sure we all understand. So, language, just to start with like a working definition, because I think that's important. In AP Psychology, or really just in general, language is defined as spoken, written, or gestured work. And I think it's important to throw that gestured work in there because we sometimes forget about like American Sign Language or other forms of body language even that we use that can be construed as language. So it's any kind of way of basically communicating information from one person to another. And so we combine these words or these gestures into different combinations, and then when I hear those or read those or see those, basically information is moving from your mind to mine. It's actually kind of cool, right? Like if you think about what language actually is, it's things happening in my head moving to your head and you understanding them through basically like sounds or squiggly lines on a paper. So it's kind of a cool concept if you really think about what it is. So to understand language, we have to understand the structure of it and why the different meanings behind it. And so phonemes is a very important concept that you need to know for the test. It's one of the big vocab words for this unit, or at least in the part about language. And basically what a phoneme is the smallest distinctive sound unit in a language. And so I think the easiest way to do this is just to practice it. So the word bat has 3 phonemes, and the phonemes are b, a, t, bat. It has 3 distinct sound units. And so, yeah, phonemes a lot of times are just letters in a word, right? Each letter makes its own distinctive sound. But in the English language, we have about 40 different phonemes. So it's not just letters because we only have 26 letters in the alphabet. So if we want to look at another example of a phoneme, chat. And in the word chat, there are 3 phonemes. Ch, a, t. So the CH makes a singular sound, so it's a singular phoneme. That ch is one sound. We don't go k, h, at. It's chat, ch, at. So sometimes kids struggle with this. The most common way I see this presented on an AP test is a question will say, how many phonemes are in this word? And it'll give you a word. It's not syllables. Sometimes it corresponds with syllables, but it's not syllables. It's individual distinctive sounds in a word. So like the CH goes together. The CK would make another sound, K. PH, F, F, F. Those are all singular sounds produced. So it's the singular sounds that make up the word. And across all of human speech, even though we only have about 40 phonemes in the English language, there are 869 identified different sounds in different languages across all of human speech. So that's pretty cool. In contrast to phonemes, then, we have morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest units that carry meaning in a given language. So M and M, morpheme and meaning. That's how I remember it. It goes together, morpheme, meaning. And so it's basically when you break down a word, the different chunks that give that word meaning. So for example, when you add an S to the end of the word, that word changes its meaning because it then becomes plural. So for example, on that sheet there, or on that little picture where it says cats, cat is a morpheme because it's a word and it has meaning by itself, right? It's like a small furry animal. But if I add an S to the end of that, that S is also a morpheme because it changes singular cat to plural cat. So a lot of morphemes are either like prefixes or suffixes. So like adding UN at the beginning of a word means you're not whatever it is. Adding ED to the end of the word means it's in the past tense. Or gentle, you can't break that word down into any other smaller pieces. So just the word gentle by itself is a morpheme as well. So it's just thinking about how words are made up and what those different like pieces of those words mean. So this is a little bit, I think, trickier than phonemes because phonemes just based off a sound, but this is having to have a little bit of a deeper understanding of like prefixes and suffixes and things like that. So on this page here, we have some practice. So if you want to, in a second, just think in your head how many phonemes each of those words have. So the first word is cat. So how many individual sounds does the word cat have? Think about it. You could throw it in the chat if you want. So cat, k, a, t. 3 phonemes, right? The C makes a sound, the A makes a sound, the T makes a sound. The next one is catch. How many individual phonemes are in the word catch? So I would say there's k, a, and ch, or ch, right? There's 3 phonemes in that word as well. This next one, my students always debate me on. So think about it for a second. The word happy. How many different individual sounds make up the word happy? I would say 3 for this one, happy. Dylan, I think you're close. I think you just need to put H-A because you go h, a, p. I think you're kind of breaking it down. That's what my students do a lot too. You want to revert to like the, how you say it, happy. But there's the h sound. The H makes a sound by itself. The a makes a sound. And then the ppy makes a sound. Sometimes my students argue that the p and the y make separate sounds. But ha, h, a, p to me is 3 sounds. Typically on the AP test, it's going to be a really simple word like cat or bat. So I don't think you'll have to stress too much about it. They're not going to put some long, complicated word on there. But just to make sure we know the distinction between the syllables versus the sounds. It's the individual. Each letter makes its own sound, or the small combination of letters. Let's try the morphemes next. Hopefully you've had a second to look at them. So for morphemes, how many morphemes are in the following words? So the word adapted. How many different chunks of meaning are there in the word adapted? So We have adapt, which by itself means something, right? It means to like become used to. And then we have the id at the end, which means something in the past. So there's two morphemes in the word adapted. There's adapt and then the ed, which changes or gives meaning to the word. The word hockey is a singular morpheme. You can't break it down into any smaller chunks. Hockey is hockey. It's a sport that you play with a stick and a puck. So that by itself is its own morpheme because it has its own meaning. And then this one's kind of tricky, unpresentable. So we've got the un, which means like negative. We have the word present or present, depending how you want to say that. And then we have able, which also has meaning. So that word has 3 different morphemes in it because there's 3 chunks of it that all have different ways of looking at it with meaning. So basically any kind of prefix or suffix is going to be a morpheme, and then the root word itself is going to be the morpheme. Any questions about that? Phoneme is sound, morpheme is meaning. All right, I'm going to move on to some rules then about how we use that, but if you have any more questions, you can always throw them in there. Oh, there is a question. I'm sorry, there was a bubble over my thing. Ooh, I like this question. I'm going to come to that in a second as we talk about language development. We're going to come to that in a minute. So Dylan, I see your question. I think it's a really good question. It's an exciting question. We'll come back to it in a second after we talk about language development. All right, so the rules then of language are the grammar that we use, right? So grammar is just defined as a system of rules that allow us to communicate with one another. And it makes sense. We have to have rules because if we all spoke our sentences in different ways, we would have a really hard time understanding each other. So each language, and it's different across languages. So if you're bilingual, you may have different rules of grammar for the different languages that you know. But basically, these rules give us meaning, and they make it easier for us to communicate with one another. And so, specifically within grammar, there's this thing called semantics. And semantics have to do with the rules that give us meaning through sound. So this kind of goes with morphemes. So for example, when I add ed to the end of the word laugh, it means it happened in the past. I laughed at something. And so it has to do with how those different, adding those different sounds or parts to the individual words themselves change their meaning. So this deals more with the specific like words that make up a sentence or a paragraph or whatever. On the other hand, we have syntax, which is how we put all of the words then together. So semantics deals a little bit more with individual words, and semantics deals a little bit more with like bigger picture. So for example, when we speak, we say the nice dog. The adjective goes before the noun. And that's just like a standard rule across English when we speak. We always put the adjective before the noun. However, in other languages, and I could be wrong, I'm going to say Spanish, I believe the adjective goes after the noun. I don't fluently speak any other languages, so definitely correct me if I'm wrong. But we have like salsa verde, right? Salsa is the noun, verde is the adjective, it goes second. So across different languages, the syntax can change, but it's still the rules that govern the language. And so basically these are like things that we implicitly learn. And if you remember when we talk about implicit, it means we're not like directly taught it. It just is like, it's there and we pick it up. And so when we implicitly learn things, it's not like necessarily your parents, as they're teaching you language, are lecturing you about how it works. But as a little kid, you start to pick up on how structure happens and how language develops. And so that's going to lead us then into language development. And so the question that was asked in the chat is there any psychological basis to people having different accents, or is it mostly geographical? And I would say that it's mostly just geographical, different, like over time, obviously, different locations kind of develop their own way of speaking. And so what ends up happening is that when you're a little kid, you just pick up on whatever the sounds are around you. So if you say y'all because you're in the South and that's what you hear from birth onward, then you pick that up. If you have a different like sound to your accent or pronunciation of your words and you're a little kid and that's how you hear it pronounced, that's then how you mimic the pronunciation. A lot of language development is just little kids hearing and seeing their parents, their siblings, their teachers use language, and then them copying and learning implicitly again those basic rules and structures. So I would say that there's not necessarily, I mean, there is geography at play, right? Like it is like a geographical basis. It's just based on like where you live. It's how you speak. So I don't know that there's any specific underlying psychological basis except for the fact that where you're born and that's then how you're raised, you pick up on that language. So that's a good question. Great question. So language development then specifically happens through a variety of stages. We don't just one day start speaking in complete sentences, right? We have to learn to put it all together. So how we acquire language happens in stages. And what's fascinating to me is that by the time you graduate high school, you're going to know about 60,000 words in the English language. If you're bilingual, you're going to know even more than that, which is really amazing to think about. Being bilingual is a really, I think, beneficial thing. We can talk more about that in maybe when we review bio about the benefits of that for your brain and development. And at a very early age, as we develop language, we start to understand the rules without specifically being taught. So I already mentioned that. And there's also kind of like social and cultural rules that go along with language. It's not just semantics and it's not just syntax, but how we use language, how we use hand motions, how close we stand to other people when we talk. All of those are different social and cultural factors that you pick up on based on your culture and your society and how you're raised. So the first stage that happens in language development is just receptive language. And so at this age, this is like really, really tiny newborn babies, like 1 month, 2-month-old, 3-month-old babies. They can't speak yet. Obviously, babies don't come out of the womb speaking. That would be a little bit weird or a little bit freaky, I think, if you babies came out just talking. But they do show signs of understanding. So basically, at this point, they're receptive to language. They understand some stuff happening. And we know this because if babies hear someone talking, a lot of times they'll track where the speaker is coming from. So if someone's talking over here, they'll look that way. Or if they're talking over there, they'll look that way. So they understand there's something going along and they're paying attention to it, even though they maybe they don't totally get the context of what's happening. They're receptive to language and they pay attention to it. And really at this stage, what they do is they watch your mouth moving. And this is the earliest way that they start to pick up on actual language skills, is by watching the way that your mouth moves in response to the sounds that are coming out of it. After the receptive stage, the babies move on to the babbling stage. And the babbling stage is when they actually start to produce language, productive language. This is about 4 months or so. Again, these ages are very rough because some babies mature faster than others. And so I don't know that they'd ask you a specific time frame, except in general around 4 months. But what happens in this stage is the sounds. You start to hear the ba, 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 or the na, the different sounds on this little graphic here. Babies start making these sounds. And so one thing that's important to know is that this stage, they're not mimicking adult speech. They're not trying to say da, 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 or ma, ma, or whatever. They have no real understanding of language in that sense yet, that an object goes with a word that they're saying. What they are doing is basically they find that their vocal cords and pushing air through their vocal cords and through their mouth makes sounds, and they're just playing around with it. That's really all they're doing, is they're testing the different sounds that they can make and the different, grunting or whatever, all the different sounds that come out of their mouths. So basically it's just practice at this point. There's no meaning associated to what they're doing. It's just practice of using their vocal cords and pushing that speech out. So then babies are going to transition to the one-word stage. And this is more of what I think we think about when the mama and the dada, things like that. And so at this age, about 1 to 2 years old is when children first start to speak. Usually it's in really singular, direct words. Specifically, nouns are going to be like the main thing that little kids use. So they can say ma or mama for mom or da for dad. They may like label a family pet as like doggy or whatever the name is, but it's almost all like nouns. They might even be able to ask for something like saying like juice or something like that. But there's no really extra words. It's basically just nouns and mostly really simple words like monosyllabic words, so single words and phrases. And this is just literally called the one-word stage, so I think it's pretty self-explanatory. From the one-word stage, we move to the two-word stage, so also quite self-explanatory. And at this age, this is about 2 years old, so it kind of goes together. Two-word stage, 2 years old, 2 words at a time. So at the two-word stage, we kind of have like telegraphic speech. It's like little demands. Mama, juice. Basically, that is the equivalent of saying, Mom, could I please have a glass of juice? But at that age, babies still, or I guess toddlers, are not capable of putting it all quite together yet. They're labeling the different nouns and things like that, but there's not a lot of adjectives or other words that go along with language. So it's almost like sending a tweet. It's short and sweet and to the point, and it contains nouns with mostly verbs, like demands, things like that. And so that is it for the various stages of development. And from the two-word stage, basically, kids are just going to go on to then adding more and more in. They might add in some adjectives. They might start speaking in complete sentences. But the two-word stage is like the last kind of baby stage of development before we start hearing complete sentences and like true language development. So there's a couple of psychologists that you have to know in regards to language development, and Noam Chomsky is one. He's like one of the premier researchers on language, so knowing that name will be important. And his whole thing is that language is natural. So if we look at the nature-nurture debate, which we see played out over and over again in AP Psych, but he is definitely a nature guy. Language is inherent, it's natural, it's biological, it's genetic, all of those things. And so he would say that language develops naturally. Over time, our brains basically mature. And so as our brains are physically maturing, these are all nature things, right? Then we develop certain skills in language development. And his argument and his research is based on the fact that, like, whether you are a baby growing up in Italy or a baby growing up in Alaska or a baby growing up in Istanbul, language develops in a very similar way across the language and the background that you're in. And so basically, all babies start with nouns first. All babies start babbling, then they move to nouns and singular words and things like that. And so because there seems to be this underlying way that language develops across cultures, across languages, across time, across place, that there must be some sort of universal grammar that's like programmed in our brain and in our genetics that happen. And so that's all about Noam Chomsky, is basically that you have to understand this idea of like universal development of language and then nature, 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 nature. Very important. And so if we have a nature guy, we usually have a nurture guy that also would oppose him. So B.F. Skinner, you may remember him from our learning unit, but he is all about learning and nurture and how the environment influences us. And so Skinner would disagree with Chomsky and say that no, language is learned. Language is a nurture type process. And he says this through his research and his understanding because we associate like objects with words. There is no like universal word for television or telephone or or water or whatever, we all have our own words that mean different things. And the only way that I learn that what's in my cup right here is water is by someone telling me that and me picking that up in the environment around me. So he would say that that's clearly nurture, and that's clearly our environment teaching us these things. Other reasons why he's more on the nurture side would be that we imitate words others use. And I think this is true. This kind of gets back to that question before about saying y'all or you guys, or what other slang terms you may use. It's where we're from, right? We pick up different phrasing and different ways of talking based on who we hang around with and who we grow up with. And I think that's even true like today, with like different slang language that you guys use. I'm trying to think. I can't actually think of any hip or cool things I've heard my students say lately. Yeah, blanking. But just think of like how if a celebrity says something and then how you like work that into your language, or how kids talk about that. That's definitely an environmental factor. And then lastly, we're reinforced when we say things correct. If a little kid learns to say milk and then they get their bottle of milk, that's a reinforcement. They've then learned that saying the right word gets properly reinforced with the actual thing that they want. And so in the future, they're more likely to use the correct words. So is it nature? Is it nurture? Well, like everything in psychology, it's a little bit of both. And so we can look at Chomsky and we can look at Skinner, and actually they complement each other quite well. So genes design our mechanisms for language. The genes, the genetics, they give us the tools to develop the skills of language. And then experience fills in those skills and modifies the brain to fit however we use language. So both Chomsky and Skinner are valuable in their views on language, and we look at both of them as being important, and they just look at it in different ways. So the genes and the mechanisms allow us to develop the skills for language, and then our environment and our nurturing fills in those skills with actual words and phrases and things like that. Okay, so that's how language develops. I've got just a couple more slides to talk about problems in language development, and how the brain kind of plays a role in this. And then we're going to do a practice FRQ. So if you have any other questions, as always, feel free either throw them in the chat or in the ask a question thing. But just a few more topics and then we'll be wrapping up. So, oopsies, my slide's not switching. There we go. Oh, this handy, I forgot this was on here. I'm sorry. This handy flow chart, I think, kind of summarizes the Chomsky-Skinner viewpoint. So the genes box is clearly Chomsky, the blue environmental box is Skinner, and then we put it together and develop a mastery of a native language. If you feel like that's useful and you want to like label it with Chomsky and Skinner, I would take a screenshot or a picture of it and use it in your notes, because sometimes, especially if you're more like visual, these different charts and things like that help understanding. So all right, so what could go wrong in language development? Well, it's pretty rare, I would say, but we have what's called a critical period, and maybe you learned about this in the development unit if you've covered this already, but basically there's certain points in our life that are very important for us to reach certain milestones. If we don't reach those milestones, we actually could be like really harmed and not be able to develop those skills in the future. And language is one of those things. So basically, we've discovered that if you aren't exposed to language at an early age, you are less likely to master it. So and this is like, we've learned this through like severe abuse cases. But basically what happens is your brain prunes. We've talked about this. Like when you prune a tree, you cut things away. So if you aren't using the language centers in your brain and the neurons in your brain that are devoted to language development, what ends up happening is your brain cuts those away and uses them for something else. And so by the age of, and I want to say it's like 5 or 6, maybe 7, I don't know the exact age, and I guess that's not super important, but basically, if you do not develop the basic language skills, you're not going to ever become fluent at any language. And so this girl pictured here, her name is Genie, And she was the subject of a very interesting case study, a very sad case study, but her family severely neglected and abused her. She was literally like tied to a bed. She wasn't allowed to interact with anyone, no TV. Nobody spoke to her until I believe the age of 13, I want to say. So really, she had never experienced language or anything like that because she never heard anyone speak. She was left in a small closet by herself all day, every day, no television, no talking. And so she never learned to speak. So eventually somebody found out and they like took her from the home, obviously, because she was being severely abused. And so they put her into like a facility to try and like teach her social cues and how to develop language skills. And what ended up happening was she couldn't. Even as she like got into adulthood, she never fully developed language. She had like basic skills, like she could speak with like nouns and verbs, like a 2-year-old, right? In that two word stage, but she never fully developed like the complex skills of speaking in complete sentences in ways that make sense. And so through her case study and other research of similar incidences, which is obviously incredibly rare, thankfully, but we've learned that language does have a critical period. And if we don't use it and we don't practice it by a certain stage, then we do lose some of that capacity. You could still learn some words and some phrases and things like that, but you'll never develop like a complete fluency in any language. Other problems in language development could deal with how your brain is structured. And basically we call that aphasia is the general word that we use, which means any kind of impairment of language. Usually speaking, remember from the bio unit, language is housed in the left hemisphere, language, left, LL. So usually we would see damage to some part of the left hemisphere of the brain if you're having troubles with language. The two biggies that you need to know for the AP test are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area controls your actual physical ability to speak. So if you had damage to Broca's area, like severe damage, you couldn't make these sounds and make your mouth move in this way to make these sounds. You would not actually be able to produce any sort of words or language. Typically speaking, Broca's area deals with damage to the frontal lobe in the left hemisphere, and you can understand language in Broca's area. You could write out words and phrases, but the actual physical ability to produce the speech is gone. Wernicke's area deals with the understanding of language. And so in this case, I can speak, but I might not make sense. I might say really like weird words and phrases. And in my head, I think that I make sense and I'm trying to communicate to you, but the words don't come out right. And so there's issues with understanding in regards to Wernicke's area. So it deals with the reception and understanding of language. You also might not understand me if you have damage to Wernicke's area. So it's all about like understanding and like making sense with language. Those are just two areas of the brain that are associated with language, the two big ones that you need to know. But as we research the brain more and more, we are learning that there's multiple areas of the brain that are involved with language development. But those are the two big ones that you should be aware of, Broca and Wernicke. And then lastly, linking back entirely to this whole cognition thing. So how does cognition and language relate to one another? Well, there's this guy named Worf, and he has this theory of linguistic determinism. Basically, what this theory states is that the language that we speak determines the way that we think. And so it is kind of an extreme viewpoint, but there's some truth to it. For example, this little cartoon here is making fun of suburban white males and their like, lawn care. That's like a joke. But in reality, we talk about how Eskimos have what, like 100 words for snow or 30 words for snow. I don't know. I'm making that number up. But they have multiple words for snow because it's important to them in their culture, and the different types of snow and the different ways that snow develops has different meaning to them. And so their language determines the way that they think about snow and they think about their surroundings, and we would have a different understanding of that. What we have learned, though, in like a less extreme example, is through personality tests, that language does actually influence how we think. And so in Canada, they gave Chinese bilingual people who spoke Chinese and English personality tests. They gave them a personality test in Chinese, and they gave them a personality test in English. When they took the personality test in English, they leaned towards more like Canadian or Western traits. So things like being independent, being unique, being your own self, doing what's best for you, and kind of like your own good. Those sorts of traits seem to pop up more. They then gave those same people the test in Chinese, and then the results were actually different. The same exact people taking the same exact personality test, just in a different language, had different results. And so in the Chinese version, they lean towards more like Eastern traits, dealing with like collectivism and being a part of the like group and looking at what's best for everyone and not just yourself. And so the gist of this is the words that we use and the language that we use do influence how we think. How extreme is that? We're not really sure, but we have proof through studies that the language that we use does actually change a little bit. The way that we think of ourselves, the way that we think about our culture, the way that we think about the world around us. And that's interesting because that means language is powerful. And so knowing more than one language can also be like a really powerful tool in understanding the world around us. So that is it for new content tonight. We have not reviewed FRQs in a while, and so I want to kind of go through that again because I think FRQs are really, this is the key to like scoring well on the AP test. The multiple choice is pretty straightforward. You answer the questions, but the FRQ is how you get from like a 3 to a 4 or a 4 to a 5. Those are like the bonus points that can really bump you up. And so we use this CHUG SODAS acronym. I'm not sure if we've seen this before, but I've shown this before. And basically, it's just a good reminder of different skills and things that we should be doing when we're writing an FRQ. So the C stands for being concise. We do not need to write pages upon pages for an FRQ. We should be direct and to the point. Handwriting matters. If you are an FRQ grader, you are reading hundreds of FRQs every day when you're grading them. And so if I can't read your handwriting, it's going to be really difficult to give you a score. So you want to make sure that you're writing legibly and that you're using pen and following directions. I always highly recommend underlining the words, the vocab words that they're giving you, because again, if I'm grading hundreds of FRQs in a day, I might accidentally miss something. And if you underline it, it just draws my attention to the point and it makes it a little bit easier for me to follow along. Anything basically to make sure that you get the points that you deserve. And then with an FRQ, you never write an intro or conclusion. It's a waste of time. Don't do it. You just get right into the content. You should also space out the words. So I would leave a line or two of space between each like term. Again, just because it's easy to see then and it's easier to grade. Always go in the order that the prompt gives you the words. That way, again, you don't miss one. If you go out of order, the reader might miss one. You just want to make sure you're getting the points you deserve. Always define the word. Always apply the word. And use synonyms with the word. If the word is something with interference, then don't use the word interference in your answer. Use a synonym for that word. So, practice FRQ for this unit. This is not just with language development. We're going to go back all the way to the start of the cognition unit. But the prompt says, Jamel and Elsa have finals next week for AP Psychology, English Lit, and Physics. Jamel's first final is on Wednesday, so he begins studying on Sunday. Jamel continues to study each day leading up to finals. Elsa's first final is also on Wednesday. She begins her studying on Tuesday night as she prefers to do all her studying at once so that it is fresh in her mind. Use the following terms to discuss whether each would help or hinder Jamel or Elsa in their preparation for finals. So we've got the words distributed practice, retroactive interference, and mental set. So I'm going to just talk through how I would respond to this prompt if I was writing it. And so I've already set it up on this slide. If you have questions, you can throw them in, but I'm going to be on the screen typing, so I won't see them for a second. But basically, I always just start like this. Distributed practice is spreading out your studying over multiple days and times in order to better remember the material. So that's just a straight up definition. And so instead of saying distributed practice is distributing out your studying, because you don't want to do that, I say spreading out your studying over multiple days and times. So I'm using a synonym for distributed. So that's the definition aspect. Now I have to say how I see this applying to the prompt. So I would say Jamal is using distributed practice by studying from Sunday to Tuesday. And so now I've said who's using it. I have to talk about whether this is going to help or hinder Jamal in the studying of his finals. So I would say, because Jamal is using this technique, he is, let me rephrase that. Because this technique is best for retaining information, this will help Jamal in preparation for his exams, as he will most likely score higher on his tests. So I'm talking about what the term is, how the term is used in this prompt, Jamal is using it, and then the fact that this will help Jamal in his studying to score higher on his tests. So I've done the define, the apply part to this. So then I move on to the next term. You can see I left a little bit of a space there. I've underlined the next term. Nothing fancy. I'm going to just jump right into the definition again here. Retroactive interference is when newly learned information interferes with previously learned information, making it hard to remember. Okay, so I've defined the term. So in this case, there's really, in the prompt, nothing that like specifically relates to this. And so that's fine. This definitely happens on the AP test and on FRQs. So you just have to talk about how it could relate to this prompt. So I could say Jamal could be impacted by this if on test day he is trying to remember the formula for, let's say, standard deviation, which he learned in September, but all he can remember is the recently learned formula for, I don't know, formula for, I can't think of any formulas, the quadratic equation. Equation? Is that equation? Equation. Nope, I was right the first time. It looked weird. Therefore, this would hinder him on taking his final exam. So I set up a scenario of how retroactive interference, newly learned info, is impacting his old information. It's getting in the way of him remembering old information. Remember last time I gave you the acronym PORN to remember this: proactive old, retroactive new. But yeah, so then I set up the prompt, and then I talked about whether that would help or hinder him on the final exam. And then the last term, mental set, is a way of thinking about things that has been successful in the past. Therefore, you use it again in the future. Therefore, not spelled right. There we go. So that's the definition. And I would say I'm going to apply this to Elsa. In the past, Elsa has had success studying for a test the night before, so she does it again for finals. However, now Elsa's classes are much more difficult. She cannot think of a new approach to studying. Therefore, she uses her old successful method. This could hinder Elsa because cramming the night before a test leads to less retention of information. So again, I start with a straight definition, nothing fancy. I talk about how Elsa might be affected by this, and then I finally say that it would hinder her and why it would hinder her. And that's really all we need to be doing for FRQs. And basically just making sure you go through each one, underline the terms, define, apply. So that is really all I have for cognition. Like I said, next week we're going to do kind of a big session covering all of the different things from testing and individual differences. And then just some other things that I'm on like a, there we go. Other things as reminders, how we always end class, but basically remember, join us next week. We're always live. We're always free now. Fiveable Plus is a new option for subscriptions. Follow us on Crowdcast, follow us on YouTube, join our Facebook page, and register for upcoming events. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Bye.